A 12-year-old boy steps into oncoming traffic to save a battered pit bull. He didn't know the dog belonged to the president of a notorious Hells Angels chapter. What started as a desperate rescue turned into a dangerous debt of honor, triggering a chain of events that would alter both their lives forever. The San Bernardino sun was unforgiving, baking the cracked asphalt of Route 66 until the air above it shimmered like water. 12-year-old Leo Foster sat on the curb outside the Rusty Spoon, kicking at loose gravel. His mother, Sarah, was inside pulling her second double shift of the week. Leo's world was a blur of overdue bills, eviction notices, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of a family hovering right on the edge of ruin. He was a quiet kid, small for his age, with watchful eyes that had seen too much struggle and too little grace. Across the 4-lane highway, a massive convoy of motorcycles rumbled into the Chevron station. The guttural roar of the V-twin engines rattled the glass of the diner's windows. Leo watched them with a mix of awe and ingrained fear. There were about 15 of them, clad in heavy denim and worn leather. On their backs, the unmistakable insignia, the winged death's head of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. At the front of the pack rode a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. His name was Thomas Bear Harrison, the president of the local charter. Bear was 6'4", heavily bearded, with arms wrapped in faded prison ink and a scar that snaked from his ear down to his collarbone. Straddling the gas tank of Bear's custom, Chopped Harley was a dog. It was a massive, block-headed Mastiff Pit Bull mix named Dozer. The dog wore a thick leather collar adorned with iron spikes. Bear parked his bike, ordered Dozer to stay, and walked into the convenience store with a few of his brothers. Dozer was a fiercely loyal dog, but he was also terrified of sudden, sharp noises. As Bear disappeared inside, a rusted-out pickup truck tore down the highway, its exhaust backfiring with a sound exactly like a gunshot. The explosive crack echoed off the concrete. Panic seized the massive dog. Dozer scrambled off the leather seat, his heavy paws slipping on the slick pavement, blinded by fear. The dog bolted away from the gas station, darting straight toward the blistering, chaotic traffic of Route 66. Leo stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw the dog freeze in the center lane, disoriented by the blaring horns and the rushing metal. Then, Leo saw the semi-truck. It was a massive 18-wheeler, barreling down the eastbound lane, hauling timber. The driver was laying on the air horn, a deafening, terrifying blast that paralyzed the dog completely. Dozer just stood there, shaking, trapped in the crosshairs of 30 tons of moving steel. The truck driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming, smoking, leaving long black scars on the asphalt. But there wasn't enough time. The momentum was too great. Leo didn't think. He didn't weigh the odds. He just moved. He sprinted off the curb, his worn-out sneakers pounding the burning blacktop. He ducked past a swerving sedan, the side mirror clipping his shoulder, spinning him around. He regained his footing and dove. He slammed into the heavy dog just as the grill of the 18-wheeler eclipsed the sun. Leo and Dozer rolled hard across the rough asphalt, tumbling into the dusty gravel of the median. A split second later, the semi-truck roared past, the vacuum of its wake pulling violently at Leo's tattered t-shirt. The massive tires missed the boy's legs by inches. For a moment, the world was nothing but the smell of burned rubber, diesel exhaust, and the stinging pain of scraped flesh. Leo lay in the dirt, gasping for air, his arms wrapped tightly around the trembling, heavy frame of the dog. Dozer whined, licking the dirt and blood from Leo's scraped chin. Then, The screaming started. "Dozer." The voice was a booming, terrifying roar that cut through the noise of the traffic. Leo looked up, blinking through the dust. Bear Harrison was sprinting across the highway, dodging cars with reckless abandon, his face pale beneath his heavy beard. Behind him, a dozen Hell's Angels dropped their gas pumps and followed, a tidal wave of leather and muscle rushing toward the median. Leo froze. His chest heaved. He had grown up hearing stories about these men, violent, unpredictable outlaws. He slowly let go of the dog, pushing himself backward into the dirt, expecting the worst. He thought the giant man was going to kill him for putting his hands on his animal. Bear dropped to his knees in the gravel. He didn't even look at the boy at first. He grabbed Dozer's heavy head in his massive, calloused hands, checking the dog frantically for injuries, burying his bearded face into the dog's neck. The intimidating biker let out a choked, ragged breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. The rest of the club arrived, forming a tight, imposing wall around them, blocking the view of the rubbernecking cars. The silence among the men was heavy, dangerous. Bear slowly lifted his head and turned his dark, intense eyes toward Leo. Leo was shivering, blood trickling down his arm from a nasty patch of road rash, his clothes torn. "You—" Bear started, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He stood up, towering over the boy. The other bikers shifted, their expressions unreadable. Leo scrambled to his feet, taking a step back. "I'm sorry," Leo stammered, his voice cracking. "He was in the road. I didn't mean to." Bear held up a massive hand, silencing the boy. The giant biker took a step forward, closing the distance. He looked down at the bleeding kid, then back at the skid marks on the road, calculating how close it had been. To Leo's absolute shock, Bear didn't yell. Instead, he dropped to one knee, bringing himself down to eye level with the terrified 12-year-old. He reached out and gently grasped Leo's shoulder. "You saved my boy," Bear whispered, the harshness completely gone from his voice. "That truck. You saved my best friend's life. Kid, you could have died. I like dogs," Leo muttered, his eyes glued to the winged death's head patch on Bear's chest. Bear let out a low chuckle, a sound of pure relief. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a heavy, silver challenge coin bearing the HAMC insignia and pressed it into Leo's dirty, trembling palm. "My name is Bear," he said, staring intently into Leo's eyes. "What's yours?" "Leo. Listen to me. Leo, you bleed for my family. You become my family. You understand this club owes you a debt, a life for a life. You ever need anything, you show that coin to anyone wearing this patch." Before Leo could process the magnitude of what had just happened, Sarah burst through the crowd of bikers, screaming her son's name. She was terrified, yanking Leo away from the giant men. Bear stood up, his intimidating aura instantly returning. He tipped his head respectfully to Sarah, whistled for Dozer, and walked back across the highway. Leo watched them ride off, the silver coin burning a hole in his pocket. He thought it was the end of a crazy afternoon. He had no idea it was the beginning of a war. Life in the Foster household didn't leave room for fairy tales or superhero moments. 2 weeks after the incident on Highway 99, the memory of the giant biker and the silver coin had faded into the background of a much more immediate nightmare. Sarah and Leo lived in a decaying, ground-floor duplex on the east side of town. The roof leaked, the pipes groaned, and the landlord was a predator. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a slumlord, He was a local loan shark who preyed on desperate single mothers and vulnerable families. Sarah had borrowed $3,000 from Arthur a year ago to pay for the funeral of Leo's father. With Arthur's exorbitant, compounding interest rates, that debt had ballooned to nearly $9,000. It was a Tuesday night. The air conditioner was broken, and the small living room was stiflingly hot. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, a stack of past-due bills scattered around her. Leo was on the faded sofa, pretending to read a school book, but his eyes kept darting to his mother. He hated feeling so helpless. He hated the dark circles under her eyes. Then came the knock. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a heavy, violent pounding that rattled the cheap wood in its frame. Sarah flinched, her face draining of color. "Go to your room, Leo," she whispered frantically. "Mom, now, Leo, please." Leo backed into the short hallway, but refused to close his bedroom door. He peeked around the corner, just as Sarah unbolted the front door. Arthur Pendleton stood on the porch. He was a thick, greasy man in his late 40s, wearing a sweat-stained dress shirt tight over a protruding gut. He smelled of cheap cigars and stale beer. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed his way into the living room, forcing Sarah to stumble backward. "We have a problem, Sarah." Arthur sneered, his eyes scanning the meager apartment with disgust. "You missed your payment. Again." "Arthur, please," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. "My hours got cut at the diner. I have $400. I can give you that right now, and I'll have the rest by Friday. I promise." Arthur laughed, a dry, cruel sound. He walked over to the kitchen table and picked up a framed photograph of Leo's late father, examining it mockingly. $400 doesn't even cover this week's interest. Sarah, you're bleeding me dry. I'm a businessman, not a charity. I just need a few more days." Arthur slammed the picture frame down on the table, shattering the glass. Sarah screamed, jumping back. "You're out of days," Arthur roared, dropping the facade of the polite businessman. He stepped into her personal space, jabbing a thick, stubby finger into her shoulder. "You owe me $9,000. You're going to pack your trash, and you and that brat are going to be out of my property by tomorrow morning, or I'll have my boys come down here and throw your crap into the street, and we'll see what else you can do to pay off that debt." He reached out and grabbed Sarah violently by the wrist, pulling her toward him. "Do we understand each other?" In the hallway, Leo felt a surge of blind rage. He dropped his book and sprinted into the living room, throwing his small weight against Arthur's side. "Leave my mom alone," Leo screamed, swinging his fists. Arthur grunted in surprise, taking a half step back. He looked down at the boy with pure malice. "You little punk," Arthur hissed. He raised his heavy hand to strike the 12-year-old. Sarah shrieked, diving in front of her son, but the blow never landed. Kriak! The front door, which Arthur had left ajar, swung open violently, slamming against the drywall. The heavy, thudding sound of steel-toed boots echoed on the linoleum. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur froze, his hand still raised in the air. He slowly turned around. Standing in the doorway, blocking the streetlights, were 3 massive figures. At the center stood Bear Harrison. Flanking him were 2 heavily tattooed, stone-faced Hells Angels known on the streets as Jax Miller and Crow Henderson. They were in full colors, their leather cuts creaking as they stepped into the cramped living room. Bear's eyes bypassed Arthur completely. He looked past the slumlord, locking eyes with Leo, and then shifted his gaze to Sarah, noting her terrified posture and the red mark forming on her wrist. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating. Arthur Pendleton's face went from an angry crimson to a sickly, pale white. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking. "Can I help you, boys?" Arthur managed to squeak out, attempting a bravado he clearly didn't feel. "This is private property." Bear didn't answer him. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He stopped mere inches from Arthur. The top of Arthur's head barely reached Bear's chin. "You Arthur Pendleton?" Bear asked. His voice was quiet, unnervingly quiet. It was the calm before a devastating storm. Yes," Arthur stuttered. "I own this building. I'm just collecting rent." Jax Miller stepped forward, picking up the shattered picture frame from the table. He looked at it, then dropped it into the trash can. "Looks like you're collecting more than rent, Artie." Bear slowly reached into his denim jacket. Arthur flinched, instinctively raising his hands, expecting a weapon. Instead, Bear pulled out a thick roll of $100 bills bound by a rubber band. "The boy," Bear said, his deep voice vibrating in the small room, "is under the protection of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, which means his mother is under the protection of the club." Bear flicked the rubber band off the cash. He didn't hand it to Arthur. He let the heavy stack of hundreds drop onto the cheap linoleum floor, scattering around Arthur's scuffed shoes. "There's $9,000, Bear said coldly. "The debt is paid." Arthur stared at the money, his greed battling with his absolute terror. The interest." He started to whisper, unable to stop his predatory instincts. Faster than a snake strike, Bear's massive hand shot out, grabbing Arthur by the throat. He didn't choke him, but the grip was like a steel vice, lifting Arthur onto his tiptoes. "There is no interest," Bear growled, his face inches from Arthur's sweaty forehead. "There is no more rent. There are no more visits. If I ever hear that you drove down this street, if I ever hear that you looked in this woman's direction, if I even hear you breathe her name in your sleep, me and the boys will come back, and we won't bring money. Do you understand me?" Arthur choked, nodding frantically, his eyes bulging. Bear let go, shoving Arthur backward. The slumlord stumbled, falling hard onto his backside. He scrambled on the floor, frantically grabbing the scattered $100 bills, stuffing them into his pockets with trembling hands. "Get out!" Crow Henderson barked, stepping aside to clear the doorway. Arthur didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and practically sprinted out the door, tripping over the porch step in his haste to escape the terrifying presence of the bikers. The sound of his car tires squealing down the block echoed in the night. In the living room, the heavy tension slowly evaporated. Bear turned back to Sarah, his entire demeanor softening. He took off his sunglasses and offered her a surprisingly gentle, apologetic look. "Ma'am," Bear said, his voice respectful. "I apologize for the intrusion, and for the mess. We had some boys keeping an eye on the neighborhood to make sure Leo was all right. They saw that piece of garbage force his way in." Sarah was shaking, her mind unable to process the whiplash of the last 5 minutes. You just paid him $9,000. I can't pay you back. I don't have—" "Stop," Bear interrupted softly. "You don't owe us a dime. Your son stepped in front of 30 tons of steel to save my dog. He gave me my family back." Bear looked down at Leo, a small, proud smile touching his bearded face. "I told him we owed him a debt. The angels pay their debts. Bear reached out and ruffled Leo's hair, treating the boy not like a kid, but like an equal. You did good tonight, kid. Standing up to him like that. Before Sarah could formulate a response, Bear tipped an imaginary hat to her. Have a good night, Mrs. Foster. You won't be bothered again. The three massive men turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the night as quietly as they had arrived. Leo stood in the hallway, staring at the empty doorway, the silver challenge coin heavy in his pocket. He had saved a dog, but he was beginning to realize that the men who rode with the death's head patched on their backs had just saved him. But as the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Sarah pulled Leo into a tight, desperate hug. She wasn't just relieved. She was terrified, because she knew something her 12-year-old son didn't. When you owe your life to outlaws, the bill always comes due. And the real twist of fate hadn't even begun to show its teeth. For a month, the Foster duplex was peaceful. For the first time in his life, Leo didn't wake up to the sound of his mother crying over the calculator. The suffocating weight of Arthur Pendleton's debt had vanished, replaced by a cautious, fragile optimism. But in a city where the streets have eyes, outlaws aren't the only predators lurking in the shadows. It started on a gloomy Thursday afternoon. Sarah was putting away groceries when a heavy knock hammered against the front door. Expecting the mailman, she pulled it open, only to find two men in cheap, off-the-rack suits standing on her porch. The lead man flashed a gold badge. Detective Ray Caldwell, San Bernardino PD. We need to step inside. Mrs. Foster. Caldwell didn't wait for permission. He brushed past her, his partner closing the door behind them. Caldwell had cold, dead eyes, and the smug arrogance of a man who enjoyed cornering his prey. He paced the small living room, taking in the cheap furniture before turning a hard stare on Sarah. Arthur Pendleton came to us with an interesting story, Caldwell began, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He checked into the ER 3 weeks ago with severe bruising and a stress-induced heart palpitation. He claims you hired Thomas Bear, Harrison, and the Hells Angels to extort him, threaten his life, and rob him of $9,000. That's a lie, Sarah gasped, her blood running cold. Arthur was extorting us. He was going to throw us out on the street. Bear. Mister. Harrison just paid my debt. He didn't rob anyone. Caldwell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's a touching narrative, unfortunately. Bear Harrison is the target of a 3-year federal racketeering probe. And right now, Mrs. Foster. You look like an accomplice to armed robbery and gang affiliation. That carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years. Sarah stumbled back, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter to keep from collapsing. I haven't done anything wrong. You can't take me away from my son. I don't want to, Caldwell said, leaning in close. I want Harrison. So, here's the deal. We know Harrison checks in on you. The next time he does, you're going to wear a wire. You're going to get him on tape, admitting he assaulted Pendleton on your behalf. You do that. And you and the boy walk away clean. If you refuse, I call Child Protective Services right now, and Leo goes into the foster system while you wait for trial in county lockup. From the cracked door of his bedroom, Leo heard everything. His stomach twisted into a violent knot. The police, the people supposed to protect them, were using his mother as bait to trap the only man who had ever truly helped them. Caldwell gave Sarah 48 hours to decide and left, leaving a suffocating silence in his wake. Sarah collapsed onto the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Leo knew his mother would do it. She would wear the wire, betray Bear, and risk the wrath of the Hells Angels, all to keep Leo out of a group home. But Leo also knew what happened to people who wore wires against the cartel or the club. They didn't live long enough to testify. That night, while Sarah slept an exhausted, tear-stained sleep, Leo made his choice. He quietly slipped out of his bedroom window, grabbed his rusted BMX bike, and pedaled into the darkest part of town. The Hells Angels clubhouse was an imposing fortress surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Dozens of custom Harleys were lined up under harsh halogen floodlights. Heavy metal music thumped from inside the reinforced cinder block building. Leo rode up to the heavy iron gate, a massive prospect with a shaved head and a neck tattoo of a spiderweb stepped out of the guard shack, shining a blinding flashlight directly into Leo's face. "You're lost, kid. Turn the bike around." The prospect growled. Leo squinted against the light. His hands were shaking, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy silver challenge coin. He held it up through the chain-link fence. "I need to see Bear," Leo said, his voice surprisingly steady. "He gave me this." The prospect lowered the flashlight, staring at the winged death's head on the coin. His demeanor shifted instantly. He unlocked the gate. "Leave the bike. Follow me." "Follow." Leo was led through a maze of leather-clad men, billiard tables, and thick cigar smoke until he reached a back office. Bear was sitting behind a massive oak desk. Going over ledgers, Jax Miller and Crow Henderson flanked him. Bear looked up, genuine surprise crossing his rugged features. "Leo, what the hell are you doing here at 2 a.m? Leo didn't waste time. He spilled everything. He told them about Detective Caldwell, the threats of foster care, and the plan to make his mother wear a wire. The temperature in the room plummeted. Jax Miller cursed under his breath, his hand instinctively dropping to his belt. Bear simply sat back in his heavy leather chair, his dark eyes boring into the wall as he processed the information. "You understand what you just did, Leo?" Bear asked quietly. "By coming here, you protected my family. But if Caldwell finds out you warned me, he'll destroy your mother." "You saved us," Leo said, his chin held high despite his fear. "A life for a life. That's what you said." Bear stared at the brave 12-year-old for a long, silent moment. Then, a slow, dangerous smile crept across his bearded face. "All right, little brother. You did your part. Now, let the angels handle the law." 2 days later, Detective Caldwell swaggered up to the Fosters' duplex, carrying a briefcase containing the surveillance wire. He didn't bother knocking, expecting a broken, compliant Sarah to let him in. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. "All right, Sarah, time to prep." Caldwell started, but the words died in his throat. Sitting on the faded floral sofa wasn't Sarah. It was Bear Harrison, looking entirely relaxed, flanked by Jax and Crow. Sitting in the armchair to Bear's right was a man in a crisp, $5,000 Armani suit, holding a polished leather notepad. Sarah and Leo were nowhere to be seen. Caldwell froze, his hand dropping toward his service weapon. "What the hell is this? Where is Mrs. Foster?" The man in the suit stood up, adjusting his silk tie. "Mrs. Foster and her son are currently checking into a luxury suite at the Four Seasons, paid for by a private trust. My name is Richard Sterling, senior partner at Sterling and Vance Defense. I represent Mr. Harrison, and as of this morning, I am on retainer for Mrs. Sarah Foster." Caldwell's face paled. Richard Sterling was the most ruthless, expensive criminal defense attorney on the West Coast. He destroyed careers for sport. "This is an ongoing police investigation," Caldwell stammered. "This is criminal extortion," Sterling countered, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "You threatened a single mother with the removal of her child to manufacture evidence against my client. We have statements. We have your illegal threats documented, and my private investigators have already pulled the internal affairs file regarding your little habit of suborning perjury." Sterling took a step forward, towering over the detective. "Here is what is going to happen. Detective Caldwell, you are going to walk out of this house. You are going to permanently close whatever fictional file you have on Sarah Foster. If you ever come within 100 yards of her, her son, or my client without a signed warrant from a superior court judge, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary with the very men you put away. Do we have an understanding?" Caldwell looked at Sterling, then at Bear, who offered a cold, mocking wink. The detective knew he was beaten. He swallowed his pride, turned on his heel, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Bear let out a low chuckle, pulling a thick cigar from his vest. "Well played. Richard, that day changed the trajectory of Leo Foster's life forever." The Hells Angels didn't just walk away after defeating the corrupt cop. Bear Harrison understood the boy's potential and the dangerous reality of their world. He refused to let Leo be pulled into the criminal underworld. Instead, Bear set up an anonymous educational trust fund. Every tuition bill, every book, every expense was paid for in cash by private donors. Bear became a distant but fiercely protective surrogate father. Enforcing strict rules, Leo was to get straight A's, stay away from gangs, and never ride a motorcycle. 15 years later, the dust of San Bernardino still blew hot. But Leo Foster wasn't sitting on the curb. Doctor. Leo Foster stood in the pristine examination room of his own veterinary clinic, wearing a white coat. He gently bandaged the paw of a nervous rescue pit bull. The bell above the clinic door rang. The massive, intimidating figure of Bear Harrison, now entirely grey-bearded, but no less imposing, walked in. He was holding the leash of a young, energetic mastiff puppy. Leo smiled, wiping his hands and walking around the counter to embrace the giant biker. It was a collision of two entirely different worlds, bound together by blood, honor, and a 12-year-old boy's courage. Leo had saved a biker's dog from the street, and in return, the Hells Angels had given him the ultimate protection, the freedom to build a beautiful life. Would you have risked it all to warn the Hells Angels, or would you have trusted the police? Leo's incredible choice proves that sometimes the most dangerous people hold the strongest codes of honor. If this story of loyalty and redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life stories. A freezing night, a single act of kindness, and the deafening roar of 100 choppers shaking the asphalt, when a shivering teenager handed over his only winter jacket to a stranded Hells Angel. He thought he'd made a quiet sacrifice. He had no idea he'd just summoned an army. The wind howling through the Cascade Mountains that November sounded less like moving air, and more like a wounded animal tearing through the pines. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the temperature had plummeted to a brutal 14 degrees. Inside Cooper's Gas and Grub, A dilapidated service station sitting entirely alone on a desolate stretch of Highway 26, 17-year-old Toby Harrison was desperately trying to stay awake. Toby wasn't supposed to be working the graveyard shift. He was a high school junior, carrying a solid B average despite operating on a permanent deficit of sleep. But his mother, a waitress at a diner 3 towns over, had recently had her hours cut, and the stack of red-stamped past-due bills on their kitchen table was growing into a small mountain. Toby had begged his manager, a gruff old man named Arthur Pendleton, for the extra hours. Arthur had agreed, leaving Toby alone to manage the pumps, the stale coffee, and the terrifying isolation of the mountain pass in the dead of winter. To combat the biting drafts that slipped through the cracks in the gas station's cheap windows, Toby was wearing his most prized possession, a heavy, fleece-lined, insulated Carhartt jacket. It was practically brand new, a dark, rugged canvas armor that he had saved up for over 3 months. It wasn't just a jacket, it was his survival gear. Toby didn't own a car. Every night at 2 a.m., when his shift ended, he had to walk 2 miles down a pitch-black, unlit dirt road to get back to his family's small, drafty trailer. Without that jacket, the walk was not just miserable, it was actively dangerous. Outside, the first violent flurries of a forecasted blizzard began to slam against the glass. The radio crackled with static, the local DJ warning everyone to stay off the roads. The ice was thickening, turning the asphalt into a black mirror. Then, through the howling wind, Toby heard a sound that made his stomach drop. It was the distinct, heavy, rhythmic sputter of a V-twin motorcycle engine. But it sounded sick. It was coughing, backfiring, and struggling against the gale. Toby wiped a circle of condensation off the glass and peered out into the dark. Beneath the flickering, yellow halo of the single working streetlight in the parking lot, a massive Harley-Davidson lurched to a halt. The engine gave one final, violent shudder and died completely. The rider sat frozen for a moment. Then, with movements that seemed stiff and agonizing, he swung a heavy, leather-clad leg over the seat and kicked the stand down. As the figure walked toward the glowing neon open sign of the convenience store, Toby's pulse quickened. The man was a giant, standing easily 6'4", broad-shouldered and heavy-set. But it wasn't his size that made Toby swallow hard. It was what he was wearing. Over a thin flannel shirt, the man wore a heavy leather vest. Even through the falling snow, Toby could clearly see the patches. The top rocker arched over a grinning skull with wings, the infamous Death Head logo. The bottom rocker proudly declared his territory. It was the full, unmistakable colors of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. In this part of the Pacific Northwest, the Hells Angels were legends, spoken about in hushed tones. They were a fiercely guarded brotherhood, known for their strict codes, their intimidating presence, and their absolute intolerance for disrespect. Seeing one alone, stranded in a blizzard, was like finding a wounded apex predator in your living room. The bells on the door jingled violently as the biker shoved his way inside. A blast of sub-zero air followed him, scattering a stack of lottery tickets off the counter. Toby immediately noticed 2 things. First, the man was older, likely in his late 50s, with a thick, graying beard that was currently caked in solid ice. Second, and more alarming, the man was shivering violently. His lips were a terrifying shade of pale blue, and his skin had the waxy, bloodless look of severe hypothermia. Don't tell me you're closed, kid." The biker rasped. His voice was deep and gravelly, but it trembled so badly he could barely form the words. "No, sir," Toby stammered, his grip tightening on the mop handle. "Open till 2. The biker nodded slowly, staggering toward the back of the store where a small, ancient space heater sat glowing orange on the floor. He practically collapsed onto a milk crate beside it, holding his massive, bare, tattooed hands toward the weak heat. His leather vest offered zero protection against the biting cold, and his thin flannel was soaked through with melted snow. "Bike gave out," the man muttered, almost to himself. "Alternator, I think. Lost the headlight 2 miles back. Rode blind until the engine seized." Toby stood frozen behind the register. He had been told by other clerks to never engage with the motorcycle clubs that occasionally passed through during the summer, to just ring them up, keep his head down, and let them leave. But this wasn't a pack of loud, imposing riders. This was one man who looked like he was freezing to death. "I have fresh coffee," Toby offered, his voice cracking slightly. "It's on the house." The biker looked up, his ice-crusted eyebrows raising slightly. Yeah, that'd be good." Toby grabbed a large styrofoam cup and filled it to the brim with the steaming, black sludge that had been sitting on the burner for the last 2 hours. He walked around the counter, keeping a respectful distance, and handed it to the massive man. The biker reached for it, but his hands were shaking so uncontrollably that he nearly dropped the cup. Dark coffee sloshed over the rim, burning Toby's knuckles, but he held steady, helping guide the cup to the man's hands until he had a firm grip. "Thanks, kid," the biker grunted, taking a long, scalding sip without even wincing. "Name's Jim. They call me Big Jim Larson." "Toby," the teen replied, taking a step back. "Well, Toby, you picked a hell of a night to work the register," Jim said, offering a weak, shivering smile. The warmth of the coffee seemed to bring a tiny bit of color back to his face, but the violent shaking didn't stop. Hypothermia had already set in deep into his core. Do you need me to call someone? Mr. Larson?" Toby asked. "A tow truck, the police." Jim's eyes snapped up, flashing with a sudden, sharp intensity. "No cops. I don't need no blue lights out here, and a tow truck ain't gonna do me any good right now." He set the coffee down on the floor, rubbing his hands together. "I ain't out here for a joyride. Kid, my chapter brother, my best friend, Thomas, he's up at St. Jude's Medical Center in Portland. They called me an hour ago, said he's not making it through the night. I gotta be there." Toby felt a pang of empathy. He remembered the night his own father had passed away in a sterile hospital room, and the desperate, suffocating panic of trying to get there in time to say goodbye. "Portland is 40 miles from here," Toby said softly. "The roads are icing over. Even if your bike was running, you'd never make it in this storm. Not dressed like that." Jim let out a frustrated, rattling cough. "I'll hitchhike. I'll walk if I have to. I ain't letting him die alone." The biker tried to stand up, his massive frame towering over Toby, but his legs immediately buckled. He fell back onto the milk crate, his breathing shallow. He was losing the battle against the cold, and the drop in his core temperature was making him uncoordinated and weak. Toby looked out the window. The snow was falling thicker now, a blinding white sheet obscuring the highway. Nobody was driving in this. Hitchhiking was a death sentence. Toby remembered that old man Henderson, a local freight hauler, was parked around the back of the station, sleeping in his cab before making a late-night run toward Portland. Henderson was a gruff guy, but he owed Toby a few favors for covering up the times he'd left the diesel pumps a mess. "Wait here," Toby said, turning toward the back door. He dashed out into the freezing wind, sprinting around the side of the building to the massive 18-wheeler idling in the dark. He pounded on the heavy metal door until a very grumpy Henderson rolled down the window. After 5 minutes of frantic explaining, pleading, and calling in every favor he had, Toby convinced the trucker. Henderson was heading right past St. Jude's anyway. He agreed to take the biker, but he warned Toby, "I'm leaving in exactly 3 minutes. Kid, if your biker friend ain't in the cab by then, I'm rolling without him." Toby sprinted back inside, practically sliding across the linoleum floor. "Jim, I got you a ride. A trucker out back is heading straight to Portland. He can drop you 2 blocks from the hospital." Relief washed over the giant biker's face. He forced himself to stand, grabbing the counter for support. "Kid, I owe you. You have no idea." But as Jim stood up and the door to the station blew open, letting in a horrifying blast of sub-zero wind, Toby realized a fatal flaw in the plan. The truck's heater had been broken for weeks. Henderson drove in a heavy parka. Jim, shivering violently in his wet flannel and leather vest, wouldn't survive the 40-mile, slow-moving drive in a freezing truck cab. Jim felt the wind and stopped in his tracks, his teeth chattering so loudly it echoed in the quiet store. He looked down at his own trembling hands, realizing the grim reality of his situation. He was too cold. He wasn't going to make it. Toby looked at the clock. It was 12:30 a.m. He looked at Jim, who was staring out the door with a look of desperate, quiet defeat. Then, Toby looked down at his heavy, fleece-lined Carhartt jacket. He thought about the 2-mile walk home in the dark. He thought about the biting wind, the ice, and his mother's frantic worrying. He thought about how long it had taken him to save the money for it. 3 minutes, Henderson had said, before his brain could talk him out of it. Toby unzipped his jacket. He slid it off his shoulders, the sudden absence of its warmth sending an immediate, shocking chill down his spine. He held it out toward the towering Hell's Angel. "Take it," Toby said, his voice steady despite the sudden cold. Jim Larson stared at the thick canvas jacket, then looked down at the skinny teenager standing before him in nothing but a faded, thin cotton flannel shirt. The biker's eyes widened in disbelief. "Kid, are you out of your mind?" Jim rasped, stepping back. "You work in a freezer. I saw you looking at that clock. You got to walk home, don't you?" "I'll run," Toby lied smoothly. "It'll keep me warm. You need it more. The truck doesn't have a heater. If you don't take this, you're not going to make it to your brother." Jim hesitated. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, nobody gave you something for nothing. Trust was earned in blood and miles, not handed over a linoleum counter by a kid making minimum wage. But as he looked into Toby's eyes, he saw no angle, no calculation, just a kid trying to help a man in pain. A loud, piercing blast from an air horn shattered the silence outside. Henderson was warning them. Time was up. Jim reached out with a trembling hand and took the jacket. The thick canvas looked almost comical in his massive grip, but as he slid his arms into the fleece-lined sleeves and pulled it tight over his leather cut, a low groan of absolute relief escaped his lips. The heavy insulation immediately trapped his remaining body heat. "Toby," Jim said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the tremor for just a second. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver Zippo lighter, tossing it onto the counter. I don't forget. And the angels don't forget. Before Toby could respond, the giant man turned and pushed his way out into the blizzard, jogging toward the idling semi-truck. Toby watched through the frosted glass as the passenger door swung open. Jim climbed inside, and the massive rig roared to life, disappearing into the blinding white snow. Toby was completely alone again. He walked over to the counter, picked up the heavy Zippo lighter, and slid it into his pocket. It was freezing cold against his leg. The next hour and a half moved at an agonizing crawl, every time the wind hit the windows. Toby shivered. When 2 a.m. finally arrived, he locked the front door, shut off the neon sign, and turned off the lights. He stood by the back door for a long time, staring out into the pitch-black night. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had plummeted even further. It was 10 degrees. Taking a deep breath, Toby pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a physical blow. It punched the air out of his lungs. The thin cotton of his flannel shirt offered exactly 0 resistance to the wind. Within 30 seconds, his arms were covered in goosebumps. Within 2 minutes, his teeth were chattering violently. He started to jog, just like he had told Jim he would. But the dirt road was slick with black ice. After slipping and falling hard on his hip, he was forced to slow down to a brisk, agonizingly stiff walk. 1 mile to go, he thought, wrapping his arms tightly around his chest, his hands tucked under his armpits. His fingers were already going numb. He cursed himself. He cursed his bleeding heart instincts. Why did he care about some outlaw biker he had just thrown away 3 months of savings and subjected himself to absolute torture for a total stranger who would probably pawn the jacket for gas money the next day? The cold began to burn. His ears felt like they were being sliced by razor blades. He kept his eyes focused on the ground, placing 1 foot in front of the other, hallucinating the warmth of his trailer. He imagined his mum's space heater. He imagined a hot shower. By the time he finally saw the faint, yellow porch light of his family's trailer, Toby was stumbling. He couldn't feel his feet, and his vision was blurring at the edges. He practically threw himself up the metal steps, fumbling blindly with his keys with wooden, unresponsive fingers. He pushed the door open and collapsed onto the worn carpet of the living room, kicking the door shut behind him. He crawled toward the small heating vent in the floor, curling into a tight ball, shivering so violently that his muscles ached. He lay there for hours, the Zippo lighter pressing hard against his thigh, drifting into a restless, exhausted sleep, convinced he had made the stupidest mistake of his life. He had no idea that a few hours away, in the harsh fluorescent light of a hospital waiting room, Big Jim Larson was making a phone call that was about to turn Toby Harrison's world upside down. The harsh, grey morning light filtering through the frosted windows of the trailer was merciless. Toby groaned, his head pounding with a ferocious, dull ache. He was still curled up on the threadbare carpet directly over the heating vent, clutching his knees to his chest. His throat felt like it was lined with broken glass, and a deep, rattling cough tore through his chest the moment he tried to sit up. "Toby, what on earth are you doing on the floor?" His mother, Diane Harrison, stood in the doorway of the tiny kitchen, clutching a chipped ceramic mug of tea. She looked exhausted, the deep circles under her eyes, a permanent fixture since his father passed. When she saw him shivering, still wearing nothing but the thin, damp flannel shirt from the night before, her maternal instincts immediately kicked into overdrive. "Where is your coat?" she demanded, rushing over and pressing a cool hand against his burning forehead. "You're burning up, Toby. Honey." Where is your car, Hart?" Toby averted his eyes, staring at the peeling linoleum. I lost it. Mum, I left it at the station. Someone must have swiped it while I was in the back." Diane's face fell. It was a look of pure, unadulterated defeat that broke Toby's heart. That jacket was a symbol of his hard work, an expensive necessity they absolutely could not afford to replace. "Oh, Toby," she whispered, her voice cracking. Okay. We'll figure it out. Get into bed. I'm going to make you some soup." For the next 4 hours, Toby drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the freezing mountain pass and the towering silhouette of Jim Larson disappearing into the snow. He felt a gnawing guilt for lying to his mother, but he couldn't bring himself to explain that he had given away their only valuable piece of winter clothing to a gang member. It was exactly 11:15 a.m. when the noise started. At first, it was just a low, barely perceptible hum. Toby thought it was the old refrigerator kicking into overdrive, but the hum didn't stop. It steadily grew deeper, heavier, vibrating through the thin aluminum walls of the trailer. Diane walked into his cramped bedroom, looking out the small window with a puzzled expression. "Is that a freight train? The tracks are 5 miles away. We shouldn't be able to hear it this loud." The hum escalated into a physical rumble. The water in the glass on Toby's nightstand began to ripple. The framed photograph of his father hanging in the hallway rattled violently against the cheap wood paneling. It sounded like a massive swarm of mechanical hornets was descending upon their quiet, snow-covered dirt road. Toby threw off his blankets, ignoring the dizzying rush of blood to his head, and stumbled to the front window in the living room. He pulled back the faded curtain and felt his blood turn to ice. It wasn't a train. It was an army. Rolling slowly down the narrow, snow-packed lane was a seemingly endless column of motorcycles. They rode in perfect, disciplined, staggered formation, their massive V-twin engines roaring in terrifying, unified harmony. The sheer volume was deafening, echoing off the surrounding pine trees. "Oh my God," Diane breathed, taking a terrified step back. "Toby, get away from the window. Lock the door." But Toby couldn't move. He was paralyzed, watching as over 100 heavily patched bikers rolled into their small cul-de-sac. The chrome of their customized Harley-Davidsons glinted dangerously in the pale winter sun. They wore heavy leather cuts over thick hoodies and flannels, the iconic Death Head logo emblazoned on every single back. The neighbors' curtains were twitching nervously, but nobody dared step outside. The Hells Angels had completely locked down the street. The column came to a halt, the engines idling with a deep, menacing thunder. Then, in a synchronized move that spoke of years of riding together, 100 kickstands slammed down onto the asphalt. The riders dismounted. Toby's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scanned the crowd of massive, bearded men, frantically looking for the familiar face of Jim Larson. But Jim wasn't there. Instead, a man who looked even more intimidating stepped forward from the front of the pack. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a cut that bore the president patch on the front breast. He had a scar running through his left eyebrow and eyes as cold and hard as flint. The man walked straight past the rusty mailbox, up the small concrete walkway, and stood directly in front of the Harrisons' thin metal door. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, waiting. "Toby, I am calling the police right now," Diane said, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her cell phone on the carpet. "No." Toby grabbed her arm. "Mum, Don't. Please, just let me handle this." Before she could stop him, Toby reached out with a trembling hand, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. A blast of cold air hit him, carrying the strong, distinct smell of exhaust fumes, stale cigarette smoke, and leather. The man on the porch stared down at Toby. Up close, he was even more terrifying. "You Toby?" the man asked. His voice was a deep, quiet gravel pit. "Yes, sir," Toby managed to squeak out, pulling his flannel tight against his shivering frame. The man nodded slowly. "Name's Wrench, Portland chapter president." He glanced past Toby to where Diane was cowering in the living room. "Ma'am, apologies for the noise. We ain't here to cause trouble." Wrench looked back at Toby and reached into the deep inside pocket of his leather vest. Toby flinched instinctively, but the biker didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a familiar, heavy canvas Carhartt jacket. It looked perfectly clean, smelling faintly of a professional dry cleaner. "Jim asked me to return this to you," Wrench said, holding it out. Toby took it slowly, the familiar weight of it offering a bizarre sense of comfort. Is Jim okay? Did he make it?" Wrench's hard eyes softened just a fraction, a shadow of grief passing over his scarred face. "He made it. Got to St. Jude's at 1:45 a.m. He got exactly 4 hours with Thomas before he passed. He was holding his hand when he took his last breath." Wrench paused, clearing his throat. "Thomas was a founding member of our chapter. He was Jim's sponsor 30 years ago. If Jim hadn't been there to send him off, it would have destroyed him." Wrench took a step closer, towering over the teenager. "Jim was suffering from stage 2 hypothermia when that trucker dropped him off. The doctors at the ER said if he hadn't been wearing this canvas jacket, his heart would have stopped from the cold before he ever reached the city limits." Toby swallowed hard, gripping the jacket tightly. "I'm just glad he made it." "You don't get it, kid," Wrench said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that demanded absolute attention. "You didn't just give a guy a coat, you saved a brother's life, and you gave our chapter the gift of letting Thomas die with his family by his side. In our world, a debt like that isn't something you just say thanks for." Wrench snapped his fingers. A second biker, a tall, lanky man with a long braided beard, stepped up to the porch carrying a thick, heavy manila envelope and a large black garment bag. "Henderson, the trucker. He talks a lot," Wrench explained, taking the envelope. "Told Jim about how you were working graveyard shifts 'cause your old man passed and your mum's struggling with the bills. Told him how you walk 2 miles in the pitch black every night." Wrench shoved the thick envelope into Toby's chest. It was heavy, breathtakingly heavy. "There's $12,000 in there," Wrench stated matter-of-factly. "Every fully patched member in 3 state chapters emptied their wallets this morning. You pay off this trailer. You pay your mum's bills. You quit that graveyard shift and you focus on getting your high school diploma." Diane let out a choked, muffled sob from the hallway, pressing her hands over her mouth in absolute shock. I can't take this," Toby stammered, trying to hand the envelope back. "It was just a jacket. It's not a gift, kid. It's a settled debt. You insult us by handing it back," Wrench warned, though there was a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He then unzipped the black garment bag the other biker was holding. Inside was a breathtaking, custom-made, heavy black leather motorcycle jacket. It was lined with thick thermal shearling. "The Carhartt is good for the dirt, but this will keep the wind off you," Wrench said, draping the heavy leather over Toby's shoulder. "Check the inside pocket. Toby reached inside the smooth silk lining of the leather jacket. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. He pulled it out. It was the heavy silver Zippo lighter Jim had left on the counter. "You show that Zippo to anyone wearing our patch, anywhere in the world," Wrench said, his eyes locking onto Toby's with fierce, unyielding intensity. "You tell them Big Jim and Wrench said you are under the shield. Nobody touches you. Nobody messes with your mother. You have a problem. You make a call, and we will ride. Do you understand me, Toby?" Toby looked at the 100 imposing men standing in his driveway, the terrifying machines idling behind them, and the thick envelope of cash in his trembling hands, the crushing weight of his family's poverty, the fear of the winter, the exhaustion. It all evaporated in an instant. "I understand," Toby whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracking down his hot, feverish cheeks. Wrench nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. He turned on his heel and walked back to his massive custom chopper. He swung his leg over, kicked the starter, and revved the engine. As one, the 100 Hell's Angels roared back to life. The sound shook the earth, vibrating deep in Toby's chest. He and his mother stood on the porch, wrapped in the freezing winter air, watching as the army of outlaws turned their bikes and thundered back down the snowy road, leaving behind a completely changed life and a debt paid in full. Sometimes, the greatest rewards come from the most unexpected sacrifices. Toby gave away his only defense against the bitter cold, never expecting an army of outlaws to repay his kindness with life-changing generosity. It proves that compassion speaks a universal language, even to the toughest crowds. If this incredible story of brotherhood and unexpected kindness moved you, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories.